Okay, today's daf we're going to learn today is Shabbat daf Kuf Mem Tet. We're going to start at the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Mem Chet. A very interesting Mishnah because it seems like this is something that we might do on a regular basis on Shabbat, and from the Mishnah it seems very clear that this is forbidden. In terms of halacha lamas, I have to say I don't really understand why people aren't so careful about this, because it appears in the Shulchan Aruch in this way. Anyway, with that intro, I will throw it at you. You can count go over your guest list, who you're inviting, who you're not inviting, or what foods you plan to serve, if you do it in your head, but not from a written list. Okay, this seems like you can't, if people do this, I used to do this. Nowadays, everything's on my phone, so I actually don't have it accessible on Shabbat. But I used to write out lists of everything I'm serving so that I don't forget what I'm planning to serve. And according to this, you actually can't look at your list on Shabbat. And what's the concern? The concern is, well, we'll see in the Gemara. Maybe I'll hold off for a minute on what the concern is, because there's going to be a debate exactly what the issue is. But it seems what they mean here is that, and maybe you'd have to say that the situation is a little bit different than our situation, although maybe there are people with this situation. But the idea is, and it's interesting, we always invite guests before, right? There's some people who already on Sunday start thinking about their guest list and who they're inviting. Obviously now, very few people are inviting guests, but let's talk about when times were normal and we used to have guests over. So you'd start thinking about, some people think about it on Sunday, some people only think about it on Friday morning, and maybe we should have guests for Shabbat, and depending on how busy your week is or what kind of person you are. But here it sounds like it's on Shabbat, and you have a list of people you plan to invite, and you want to show your shamash, like you have a person working for you who's now going to do the inviting. What does this sound like, by the way? What story, Talmudic story, do we know this about? Not that it necessarily happened on Shabbat, but the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? Where he told the person to invite and they invited the wrong person, and that caused a destruction. Hold off on this Kamsa Bar Kamsa because it actually appears in the Mishnah Berurah relating to this topic. I'll read it to you soon. But the issue here is that we're worried that you might decide to uninvite someone. Okay, let's say you don't have enough food. So you might say, I don't really want to invite that person. And you'll start maybe going back to your list, and we'll see in a minute, one of the options is maybe you might write or erase. Right? You might take him off the list. You might want to erase. So you'll erase the person off your list, and so that the person won't, they won't invite. Or you won't have enough food, so you'll take, you'll take something off your list because you don't have the food to serve, something like that. So again, it seems like you're preparing the list for somebody else, as opposed to, let's say, if I just want to refer back to my list that I prepared before for myself. Maybe that's part of the reason why it doesn't seem to be such an issue. But again, I don't really have a great answer as to why this is not such a relevant issue. I'm sure there's stuff written about it. I researched a little bit, but I didn't have enough time. Okay, in any case, let's read on. So you can read it mipi, right? You can go through it in your head, but not bichtav. Mapis adam im banav ve'im bnei beito ala shulchan u'bevad shelo yitkaven la'asot mana gdola k'neged mana ktana. If you want to start auctioning off, or really a lottery, who's going to get which portion, so you can do that at your table with your family. We're going to learn later, it seems to be only your family, not with other people. But as long as you're not trying to do, the first one, you'll get a bigger portion, and the next person, who the lottery comes out, will get a smaller portion, next person a smaller portion. That's already problematic, which we're going to learn later in the Gemara isn't really problematic. They're going to reread this Mishnah because it doesn't really make so much sense. But this is one of these Mishnayot that you don't really get until you read the Gemara on it, which again becomes a problem because, remember, the Mishnah was written in particular time period. The Gemara was written later, and they try to reinterpret the Mishnah. It could mean there's other interpretations of the Mishnah other than the ones the Gemara offers. Umitilim chalashim ala kodashim. They assume later in the Gemara they're going to assume chalashim means also a lottery. You can do a lottery for the sanctified items b'Yom Tov, on Yom Tov, meaning who gets which meat, okay, of the Kohanim, because remember the Kohanim got parts of the meat. They would get to eat it, certain of the meats. So you can have a lottery to see who gets what, avalo al hamanot, but not for the portions. Now, this seems weird. What do you mean the sanctified items, but not the portions? Again, we're going to have to figure out in the Gemara what this means. So my time, the Gemara starts off with what's the reason for this? For going back to the first topic, which is why you can't do this from a list. We're worried you might erase. Okay, you might come to erase, and if you might decide to drop someone off the list, you'll erase. Abai amar gzera shema yikra b'shtarei hadyotot. If we let you read these types of things, you might come to read documents, business documents. And business documents you're not allowed to read. We learned that from Imtzo Chafatzecha. You can't do business dealings. You also can't read business documents. If we allow you to read these documents, you might come to read business documents, which seems a little bit of a stretch, right? If I take out my list of who I'm inviting, not so sure I would get confused and think I can start opening my business documents. But that's what Abaye thinks. I want to read now in the Mishnah Berurah on Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Zayin and Orach Chaim. He says that basically he says he starts to mention, this is the first mention. I saw people who start to show that people weren't exactly so careful about this. But what he says is people aren't so careful, not what I said, but shahashamash korei mitoch haktav l'seuda. There are places where maybe I can, as the balabayit, but the shamash, my servant, he's allowed to look at the list. And then he says maybe the whole concern that you might erase is really only for the owner himself and not for the shamash. And then he says, and maybe also for a sudat mitzvah, we can be mekel, because, for mitzvah, we sometimes allow things even though there's maybe a concern. So he gives that also. But then he says, very interestingly, he says, b'shari tshuva, he quotes the shari tshuva, hevili yashev haminhag lahakel l'shamash l'kol mitoch haktav, the fact that they allow the shamash to read l'sudat harishut, not only for sudat mitzvah, but even a regular one. Why? So first he says, al shamash bi'ikar lo gazrus. And why is that? He says maybe the reason why we're not gozer on the shamash is because we're worried that the shamash might make a mistake, and therefore, right, like what happened in Kamsa Bar Kamsa, and look, it caused the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So therefore, for that reason, maybe we would, they weren't gozer on the shamash because of that story. It's very interesting how they take a Talmudic story and they use it for halacha l'maaseh, right, to explain a minhag that theoretically doesn't really make much sense according to what it says in the halacha, and yet he quotes it. So that's interesting. Now we're going to have a big back and forth between these two opinions. So the Gemara is going to ask, and here this is where the chart will help you, so you don't get lost in the back and forth. My benayu, where's there going to be a difference? In what case can we find a nafkamina, is what we call it, a difference, the halacha, whether you say it's, or we're worried that you might erase, or we're worried that you might come to read shtarei hadyotot. Yimchok, by the way, you might say these are two very different things, because yimchok is a malacha, and reading shtarei hadyotot is not exactly a malacha. It's just learned out from that verse in Yeshayahu. But really, yimchok here is not a malacha deoraita, because yimchok, if you remember, when is limchok a malacha? When you're going to erase in order to write, right? Where you're erasing amanat lichtov. This you're not erasing in order to write in place of it. So therefore, it's a malacha, but it's not a malacha d'oraita. It's not the regular mechika. Because here it's more mekalkel, right? It's more in that where it would be only asur midrabanan. So now they say, what's benayu? So the structure is going to be, we're going to have 4 different answers, although the 4th one is going to end up going back to the first one. We're going to have a question on the first one, and we'll later have to go back and say, well, we're going to say the first one anyway, and we have to resolve that question somehow. But we're going to basically have 4 options. So my benayu, ika benayu de katav akotel umidle. You wrote it on a wall at a very high place in the wall. So now, what is it? Lamandam ar shema yimchok. If we're worried you might erase, lo chashina. We're not going to worry you're going to erase because it's so high up, you won't be able to reach. Ulamandam ar shema yikra chashina. But if you're worried you're going to confuse this with business documents, so if you're reading something on a wall, you still might confuse that with business documents because you could still read it even though it's high up on the wall. You might say, who confuses walls with documents? We'll get to that. They're going to say that later. So now they say, okay, so if you say Shema Yimchok, we're not worried you're going to erase it because it's high up on the wall. And now the Gemara does something a little bit strange. Because the Gemara says, one holds Shema Yimchok, the other holds Shema Yikra. But now the Gemara says, Shema Yimchok, Michu Shema Yikra. Even though he doesn't think there's a concern that you're going to switch between, you might read, the Gemara thinks, but that's also a concern. And even the person who says you might erase should also be concerned with Shema Yikra. So basically, even though it's high up on the wall and we're not worried Shema Yimchok, you're going to erase, according to the one Rav Baby who says Shema Yimchok, I would still think, the Gemara says, that Rav Baby would still be concerned with, you might come to confuse this with documents. We're basically going to assume, and it's a very strange assumption of the Gemara, that each person is still concerned for the other. And in the end, it's going to be that there's just one case where it's kind of isolated, and each one you'll see in the end how they conclude. But they're basically saying at this point, each one should be concerned for the other. So now they say, so why isn't he concerned with Shema Yikra? That's question number one. And two, and additionally, l'shema yimchok lo chayshinan, just because it's high up on the wall, the concern of Shema Yimchok should still be a concern. Not because it's really a concern, but because of a concept that we've talked about before, which is what we call lo plug. We don't distinguish. Even though, theoretically, in this case, you won't erase, but since if it were lower, you would erase, we're going to say even if it's high. Where do we see this? Tanya, it's something we learned in the beginning of Masechet Shabbat. Lo yikra le'or haner. You can't read to the light of the candle. We just mentioned this the other day. Afilu gavoa shte komot, afilu gavoa shte mirdaot, afilu asara batim ze al gabe ze, lo yikra. Even if the light is so high up, okay, even, right, if it's two heights above you, 2 human heights, if it's the height of 2 mirdaot, which was a plowshare that they used, or even if it was 10 houses above you, okay, which is funny they say that because they didn't really build such tall buildings in those days, but I think they're just using 10 is always a number they use for exaggerated purposes. So even if it's 10 houses above, still you can't read La'or Haner because you might, even though you're certainly not, what's the issue? You're going to tilt it, right? And you'll make it last longer, or you might end up, right, also, you might end up putting it out. But either which way, Shema Yateh is a concern, even if there's really no concern that you're going to touch it. So if the light's really far away from you, you're still not allowed to use the candlelight for reading. So now they say if that's the case, then even if it's super high up and you can't erase it, still the concern should stand based on what Rabbah says. So that's not going to work. So therefore, again, we started to say maybe it's high up on the wall, and then that would be a difference. But now we're saying even if you're saying Zerah Shema Yimchok, number one, maybe still you should be concerned, Shema Yikra, that you might come to read business documents, and really Shema Yimchok will even be a concern when it's so high up. So next option. Let's move it back down. We're writing on a wall, regular height. The one who says we're worried you're going to erase, well, if it's on the wall at your height, you might come to erase. But why are you not worried we're going to think you could read business documents? People don't confuse something written on a wall with something that's a business document. You're not going to confuse that. I told you we get back to this, right? That's not something one would confuse. A list written on the wall is not the same as a business document. Nobody would ever write a business document on a wall, and therefore there's no reason for that concern. But they're going to do the exact same thing now that they did in the previous case. Still, even if you're not worried you're going to switch it with business documents, still, what are we concerned? You might erase it. So why does he allow it? So therefore, we reject that. What we're talking about is that you engraved it into either a wooden board or some sort of a notebook that they had, okay? Exactly what a pinkas is, right? There's, Rashi says it's like luchot shel socharim, that storekeepers had these. They were these boards that people would use to write things down, but instead of writing it in the tavla or pinkas, they engraved it. Now, in that case, what's obviously not going to be a concern? Erasing. You can't erase something you engraved. So Laman Amar Shema Yimchok Lo Cheshina. But Laman Amar Shema Yikra Cheshina. But these are things that people might confuse with business documents. Even though business documents generally weren't written on these things, they were written on probably parchment, but still it's more similar. Well, especially if you're going to say people don't write on walls, right? People wouldn't write a business document on a wall, but they might write it on a pinkas. So now again, they're going to say, so wait, but still he should be concerned that maybe you'll confuse it with business documents. If you want to try to suggest, maybe nobody would confuse a shtar or a pinkas or a tavla, one of these tablets, with a document. Well, that's not true, because I'll prove it from the following source that it must be people are concerned that we switch those things, and therefore we're going to be left with this can't be the possibility, because even though there's no problem Shema Yimchok, still, even though even Rabevi who says the concern is Shema Yimchok, he should still be concerned that you're going to confuse them with business documents, and therefore it's a problem. So, and therefore that can't be the case where they differ. So how do we know this? V'hatanya, and here I made a chart within the chart to help you understand this. Moneh adam kama mibifnim v'kama mibachutz. You can start counting which guests are going to sit inside and which guests are going to sit outside, right? Their houses were small. They didn't always have place for people inside. So inside was obviously the better place to sit. So you can start counting. Okay, I'm going to put this person inside and that person outside. V'kama manorati laniach lifnehem. And how much am I going to feed everybody? Michtav she'al gabei hakotel. You can read it from something written on the wall. Avalo michtav she'al gabei tavla u'pinkas. But not from anything written on a tablet or a notepad. So what do you see here? This Braita distinguishes between the two. So now they're going to say hechidami. So what's the case here? Ilem adichtiv michtav, if it's actually written and not engraved. So ma'ishnahacha. It should be a problem in both cases. On the wall also it should be a problem that you're going to erase. That shouldn't be a distinction between them. Elalav dechayik. It must be that it's engraved. And what do you see here? V'katane, michtav shal gabei hakotel, aval lo michtav shal gabei tavla u'pinkas. And therefore, it must be that on the tavla u'pinkas you can't use. For what reason, according to this Braita? Because even though it's engraved, and we're not worried you're going to erase, but we are worried you're going to confuse it with shtarei hadyotot, and they're with business documents. And therefore, what do you see here? That we do confuse tavla and pinkas with business documents, which would mean that we can't say our Mishnah is referring to that because it shouldn't be allowed. So therefore, le'olam, we're now back to option number 4, which we're going to go all the way back to option number 1 and explain what we said in option number 1. Ela le'olam de katav akotel umidle. It's where you wrote it on the wall high up. So now, what was our problem with this? Ude kakash elach de Rabba. We said Rabba's concerned. Right, Rabba says it doesn't matter that you can't erase it. Still a problem. Well, de Rabba Tanahi. There's actually Machloka Tanaim. Now it's a little tricky. Rabba is an Amora living a few generations after the Tanaim, 3rd generation. But what it means is that the Tanaim debated this exact issue that Rabba mentions later. It was debated by the Tanaim earlier. And we're going to say that's the debate between Rabbebi and Abaye's suggestion here. Okay, so how does it work? How do we know it's a Machloka Tanaim? Tanya. Moneh adam et orcha ve'et parperotav mipiv avalo minachtav. That's our Mishnah, right? You can do it bal peh, you can recite it, but you can't go over it from something written. Rabbi Acha matir michtav shal gabei hakotel. He allows it if it's written on the wall. So hechidami, what would be the case here? Ilim adichtiv mitata. If it's written low down, lichu shema yimchok. We'd be worried that you might come to erase it, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed even on the wall. So therefore, it must be elalav de katav umidlai. Must be written umidlai. It's written high up. Ushmamina de Rabba Tanai shmamina. So what do you see here? The one Rabbi Acha allows it because he says, "I'm not concerned if it's high up because you're not going to erase." And Tanakama, who says it's not allowed, says, "No. I'm very concerned you're going to erase, even though you're not really going to erase. In this case, we have to just make a clear-cut decision that you can't write on wall. You can't read from walls in general because obviously once you start measuring which height of the wall. Obviously, we know that in halacha they get into very minute details, but sometimes people say we'd rather just make it simple and keep the law very clear cut, not on walls. So now, how does this relate to Rabbebi and Abaye? So again, when Rabbebi says Gzirah Shema Yimchok, he doesn't mean only Shema Yimchok. He's also worried about Shtarei Hadyotot. But if it's on a wall and it's high up, he's going to say, I'm concerned Shema Yimchok, but I'm not concerned with a wall that you're going to confuse it with something else, but I am concerned Shema Yimchok. So when it's on a wall, nobody thinks it's a problem of Gzera Shema Yikha, Mishum Shtarei Hadyotot. Okay, nobody's worried you're going to confuse it because it's on a wall. We go back to what we said before. On a wall, you won't confuse it. What's the machloket? Rabbebi will say, I'm still worried Gzera Shema Yimchok, even though it's high up. And Abaye says, no, that concern doesn't concern me in this case. This is why I said, he does think in general it's Gzera Shema Yimchok, also in addition to Shema Yikha. But when there's, in the case where it's high up and we're not worried Shema Yimchok, he basically disagrees with Rabbah and thinks we're not worried that if it's high up, you're going to erase. And therefore, his only concern in this case would be Shema Yikha. And in this case, Shema Yikha is not relevant because people don't confuse things on the wall with business documents. And therefore, he thinks it would be allowed. Okay, whereas Rabbebi will say, no, I'm still worried Shema Yimchok, like Rabbah said, which is it doesn't matter what height, it's still going to be a problem. And it matches up with those two Tanaim that we saw just now. Now we're going to say, so that's kind of the end of that. But now they're going to bring another Machloket Tanaim about the same issue. Bahane Tanai Kahane Tanai. So these Tanaim line up with the following Tanaim also. Titanya. Ein ro'im b'mar'ah b'Shabbat. Another interesting halacha that I don't know if you're aware of. You can't look in a mirror on Shabbat. It sounds strange, right? Most of us probably use mirrors on Shabbat. Rabbi Meir matir b'mar'ah hakavua b'kotel. Rabbi Meir says, well, it's allowed if your mirror is fixed into the wall. So, ma'ishna kavua b'kotel. Okay, now what's the issue? The issue is that you might see a hair that you don't want to be there, that's longer than all the others, or a hair b'chlal, you might want to pull it out. And we can't pluck hairs on Shabbat, so therefore, they say, well, it shouldn't matter if the mirror is attached to the wall or not attached to the wall. Ma'ishna kavua b'kotel, da'adahachi v'hachi midkar, she'enu kavua nami, adahachi v'hachi midkar. In other words, whether it's attached to the wall, whether it's not attached to the wall, when you see that hair in the mirror, you might want to get rid of that hair. And then you'll end up doing a malacha d'oraita. So what do they answer? B'mar'ah shel matechet askinan. They're talking about a metal mirror. Uchidar Rav Nachman amar Rabba bar Avua. De'amar Rav Nachman amar Rabba Avua, mipnei ma amru mar'ah shel matechet asura, mipnei she'adam asui lahashir bani min hameduldalim. What's the concern with a metal mirror? That the metal mirror is sharp, or somehow you can use, I don't know exactly how you do this, but you can use, I guess you can use it like a razor, and you can cut the hair off using the mirror. Now, in which case would this be a concern? If the mirror, now you know why we don't really know from this, because our mirrors aren't made in this way and you can't really use them to pluck a hair out. And that's why I don't think this halacha is relevant nowadays. But the concern is that you might, if the mirror is detached from the wall, then you can use it to take off your hair, to pluck your hair, and therefore it'll be forbidden. But if it's attached to the wall, then there's no concern because you can't use it to pluck your hair out. So that's, now again, there's a machloket. So Rabbi Meir says, if it's kavua b'kotel, we're not worried about that. But Tanakama says you can't use a mirror at all, even if it's attached to the wall. Why would he say that? Because he holds like Rabbah and like Rav Baby and right, like all those, and like the other Tana that we saw, which is that we're concerned, even if it's not a concern in this case, if we allow you to do it when it's attached to the wall, you might come to do it when it's not attached to the wall, and then you might come to pluck out a hair, and therefore they would forbid it. So now we see this exact same machloket appears also by another topic. Okay, today is again a day where we're learning all these things that seem very clear-cut halachically from the Gemara, but nowadays it seems like the situations are a little bit different, and these are not so much concerns. I see someone wrote in the chat, which is a very good connection, about that it's like dry erase boards. Right, that often I used to do that all the time. I'd write them on a whiteboard I had hanging in my kitchen. And right there, all the more so you might come to erase it. It's very easy to erase. So you can imagine that kind of scenario. Although this is not a shiur lahalacha. So, go take this, look this up and figure out whether there's any real relevant halachic ramifications nowadays from this sugya. Okay, moving on. Tanu Rabbanan. Ktav ha'malech tachat hatzura. Here's another interesting one that also hard to understand. Halacha l'maaseh. By the way, some people come from these things and say, well, especially from here, about if you're worried about shtarei hadrotot, maybe you can't read newspapers on Shabbat. Maybe, right, there's people who are careful not to read newspapers on Shabbat because, again, you might come to think, if I could read newspapers, I could read business documents, right? This could stretch to all sorts of directions. And people do take it that way. Tanu Rabbanan, Ktav ha'malech tachat hatzura v'tachat hadiyuk naot asur l'koto b'Shabbat. So what are we talking about here? Rashi says, interesting, right? He says there's people who write on walls. They draw, and we all know, you've seen, right, hieroglyphics and other, you go to temples in Cambodia, there's all this writing on the walls. There's, all these Hindu temples, and they all have all these images on the walls. Or diyuk naot shel bnei adam, portraits of people. And underneath, Rashi says, they write, this is this animal, this is this person, and they write the names. So you can't read the writing underneath those things on Shabbat. Uvidiyukna atzman, by the way, portraits in themselves, af bechol asur l'stakel, but you can't even look at them on a regular day. Mishum shenema al tifnu el elilim. You can't turn toward idols. My Talmud, how did they learn from that pasuk that you can't look at a portrait? Amar Rabbi Chanin, al tifnu el midatchem. Okay, there's some different ways of interpreting this, but don't look at things, and Some people say, don't look away from God at things that you create, or don't look away at things that are created by man. In other words, these images or things that are images of man. So exactly how to understand this. And again, halacha l'masa, what does this mean? You can't look at paintings. You can't read, if you go to a museum on Shabbat, you're not allowed to read the writing about the painting, right? It seems, right, this seems again like a halacha that's hard for us to understand in our day and age, all of these issues. But again, there's a concern here about reading any of these things according to the Gemara. Mapis Adam, and then there's a further problem of something being a little bit of avodah zarah like about these portraits. Mapis Adam im banav ve'im bnei beito. Okay, so back to the Mishnah. So again, this requires a lot more research as to, this issue about portraits and looking at them and not, and on Chol and on Shabbat. This requires a lot more research into how we relate to this nowadays. The Mishnah had said that one can be mefis Adam im banav im bnei beito. You can make a lottery at your table and basically say, okay, whoever this falls on is going to get this portion and someone else will get a different portion. So what does it say? It says, im banav im bnei beito. In v'im acher lo. It sounds like you could only do this with family, household members, and not anybody else. My time, why is this? Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, as Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, the Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, b'nei chavura hamakpidim ze al ze ovrim mishum midah, umishum mishkal, umishum inyan, umishum lovin uporim b'yom tov. What did we say? This is just like the woman lending her or anyone lending food to somebody else, right? That you do it in a particular way. You start casting these lots. If there's a b'nei chavura that are makpidim ze al ze, that they're careful to return. If someone gets one, then they give back. Then you're going to have a problem of measuring, weighing, counting. All of these things become problematic when they're done in a semi-business-like manner, okay? And mishum lovinu porina, because people who borrow and lend, right? It's like borrowing and lending. So even on Yom Tov, you can't do this. Ukidivrei Hillel, the parentheses, it says Beit Hillel, but it seems in the Masoret HaShas to say it should say Hillel. Ukidivrei Hillel af mishum ribit. And this is what we saw the other day. Also, it's a problem with repeat, because if you give someone bread and they return you bread the next day, could be the price of bread went up, and then they're actually obligated for interest. So basically, they say you can't do this with other people because of all these concerns. So now they say, well, then you shouldn't do it with your household members either, because you'll come to measure. So what's the obvious answer? As Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, you can even loan your children money on interest. This is very interesting. You want to get them to understand how terrible loaning on interest is. So you're allowed to loan money to your children and demand interest to teach them how terrible it is to demand interest from people so that they don't come to do it themselves. So now, why are you allowed to do this? You're allowed to do this because in the end, all the money is yours, right? If you give your kids allowance or you give them money or you lend them money and they return it back to you, it's all the same. It's all your money anyway. The assumption is the kids don't own it. So even when you give it to them, so therefore you're allowed to do any of these things. You can do a goral at your table because we're not worried you're going to come to measure so precisely because it's all yours anyway. So you don't really care exactly what you're giving. So now they say, well, then something in the Mishnah makes no sense. What did it say there? You can't do mana gdola keneged mana ktana. You can't cast lots for a big portion and this one gets a smaller portion. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi mana gdola keneged mana ktana nami." Should be the same, right? It should be allowed. If we don't really care, then why can't you do a big and a larger portion? So the Gemara says, "Inachinami." Really, you're right. And chisur machasir v'hachi katani. There's actually words missing in the Mishnah, and this is how the Mishnah should read. Mepis adam im banav b'nei beito al shulchan afilu mana gdola keneged mana ktana. You can even cast lots for bigger portions and smaller portions for your children. So they now kind of change entirely what the Mishnah says and say what it really means is you're allowed to do that for your family members. My time, and what's the reason? We're just adding this parenthetically. Kid de Rav Yehuda Amarav, because obviously this isn't in the words of the Mishnah. This is Emoraim speaking. Like Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, im banav im bnei beito in v'macherim lo, meaning you can only do it with household members but not anybody else. And now my time, why can't you do it with anyone else? Kidder Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. And that's because of what Rav Yehuda said, the name of Shmuel, that we're worried you might come to Midah, Mishkal, Minyan, all that, measuring, like business-like dealings. And then they add Manag Dola Keneged Ktana, which we allowed for family members, right? And we don't allow you to cast lots on Shabbat for non-family members. But now they're going to say Manag Dola Keneged Manag Ktana, Af Bechol La'achirim Asur. Even on a regular day, you are not allowed to cast lots to give larger portions to some people and smaller portions to other people. My taima mishum kubiya. This is fascinating because you might come to think that gambling is allowed, because this is a type of gambling to cast lots and say, if you get this one, you get a bigger portion. That's basically part of gambling. Now, what's wrong with gambling? So this comes up in Sanhedrin. We'll see it when we get there. Two possible reasons. One is it's forbidden to gamble because if you spend your life gambling, you're not going to end up being osek b'yishuvo shel olam. You're not going to do something productive with your life. Right? You're going to try to make money doing with a quick fix and not actually doing something productive. And that's not a good thing. Now, that would only apply if you're a professional gambler and that's all you do, okay, but you don't have a real job. If you gamble on the side, it sounds like according to that, maybe it's okay. But the other option says gambling is a problem because of what we call asmachta. Okay, asmachta is a very big sugya. It comes up in a lot of places. There's even a whole book written about asmachta. It's a very complicated sugya. But asmachta basically means that if I don't ever really intend to give you the money in some sort of interaction between us, then if you take the money, then it's like you're stealing. So when you go to a casino, you don't really, when you put money down on the table, you don't really plan to lose it. And the casino certainly doesn't really plan to lose their money. So when you get money from a casino or you give money to someone else through a casino, so you basically, they're dealing with stolen money because you never really intended, what's called asmachta and asmachta lo kanya. There's no kinyan when you don't really intend to pass along the money. And since, right, what they say there is, right, obviously if you're gambling, you're not really planning to lose your money. If you were planning to lose your money, you wouldn't be gambling. You want to win. So if you want to win, then you're not really intending to give the money, and then people end up with stolen money. And that's why it's forbidden, which then would apply to anybody, that anyone really can't gamble according to that. So there's different opinions as to why it's forbidden, but here we're concerned if we allow you to do cast lots for bigger portions and smaller portions with regular people, then you might come to think that gambling is allowed and you might come to gamble. So because of that, you can't do it. And that's what the Mishnah means. When it said manak dola keneged manak tana, it didn't mean with your family. That's all allowed because it's all within the family and it's all the same money and you're the owner of the money anyway. But for other people, you're not allowed to do that even on a regular day, not even having to do with Shabbat. Okay. Again, that was the way the Gemara understood the Mishnah. It's not necessarily the simple reading of the Mishnah. Or I should say, it's clearly not the simple reading of the Mishnah, the way the Mishnah came down to us. Mitilim chalashim. Now we want to understand that last line. Mishnah said, mitilim chalashim, you can do, the word chalashim means lots. We're going to have to figure out where do we get that the word chalashim means lots. Normally chalashim means weak. Right? Where do we get to lots? You can cast lots on the hekdeshim b'Yom Tov, on the sanctified items on Yom Tov, but not on the portions. So we'll have to understand there's a lot of words there we don't really understand what they mean. So what does it mean, but not the manot? So Amar Rabbi Yaakov b'rei debat Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Yaakov. It seems like his father wasn't such a great person, therefore they mentioned the name of the mother. Avalo al yedei hamanot shel chol b'Yom Tov. What does that mean? Lo al hamanot shel chol b'Yom Tov, not on the portions from yesterday's sacrifices. If you're standing on Yom Tov and you want to divvy up portions from Yom Tov of the sanctified items, you can do that, but you can't do it on items that were left over from yesterday. Okay, maybe one reason is because you should have taken care of it yesterday, right? We don't like to allow you to do things on Yom Tov for things that don't have to do with Yom Tov directly or things that you could have done before. So the Gemara says, Pshita, obviously you can't do that. So why would the Mishnah tell you this? Here's a pasuk from Hosea where he says the nation is like a fighting nation. There's a lot of inward fighting, like the Kohanim fight with each other, okay? When we get to Yoma, you're going to see that they had to institute all these lotteries because the Kohanim, everybody wanted to fight for their portion, both what portions they get to eat and what portions of avoda they get to do in the Beit HaMikdash. So, afilu manot dechol nami. So if that's the case, then we shouldn't allow, right? You might have thought since it says Amcha Kemirivei Kohen, therefore even manot of chol, you can also do on Yom Tov, because we don't want people to end up arguing with each other, quarreling. So Kamash Malan, from here we learn that you can't. Okay, so you might have thought it was allowed because to minimize quarreling in the Beit HaMikdash, but Kamash Malan, you can't do it. Amar Rabbi Yaakov Berei Debat Yaakov. Since we mentioned Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Yaakov, we're now going to mention another thing about him that he said. Kol shechavero ne'anash al yado, another interestingly strange statement. If you cause someone else to get punished, okay, it seems to imply here that if someone does something bad to you and they get punished because of it, so you also you basically get punished, that God doesn't really want you in the midst of like where God is. Why is that? Because you caused punishment to someone else. Now it's a little bit odd because he did it to you, and now you, because of what someone does to you, you cause that person to get punished, and therefore you are no longer invited to be where God is. Okay, it seems a little unfair to you because what did you do wrong? But the assumption is that if you somehow cause someone to do something bad to you, maybe you're somehow responsible for that, and in which case God doesn't really want you in his midst. So now we have to figure out where we get this statement from. Minalan, where does he learn this from? Elam, and we're going to offer some suggestions. Maybe it's Mishum Dichtiv. Vayomer Hashem, Mi yifatet Achav v'ya'al v'yapol v'ramot Gilad. In the end, Achav, who was a terrible king of Yisrael, he in the end goes and dies in a battle. But now the Torah, the Navi in Sefer Melachim, they describe the scenario going up in the heavens, where God says who's going to seduce Achav so that he will go out to war. And basically what happens is someone goes and puts lies in the mouths of the prophets. They prophesize that he's going to win the war, and he goes out to war, and he ends up dying. So who's going to do it? People offer suggestions about how we can get him to go. And then all of a sudden the spirit comes up. Hashem stands before God. I'll do it. He says, I'll go be this false testimony in the mouths of all the Nevi'im. So what does God say to him? Tifateh v'gam tuchal. Go for it. Open the doors for you. Save aselecha. Go out and I will do this, right? And do it. Asechen. Do exactly as you said. Now you would think this sounds like a positive thing, but we're going to see that this sounds negative. So they say, who's this ruach? It was the spirit of Navot Yisraeli. If you remember the story, he had a beautiful kerem that was right next door to Achav, and Achav wanted it. And he basically, in order to get the land, Navot wouldn't, if I remember correctly, he wouldn't sell it to him. In order to get it, he calls him Moreh B'Malchut, a traitor, and he gets him killed. So it's the spirit of Navot who basically comes to say, I'm going to be the one to punish Achav. Might say, and when God says, go out and do this, which we thought was a positive thing, Amarav, same im chitzati. Go out of, I don't want you back in the heavens. Okay, if you're going to be the one to do this, now it's ironic because God obviously needs someone to do it. But on the other hand, he shouldn't have gotten up and offered. Okay, it's saying the fact that he, it's also like when you jump to, you can imagine the Ruach of Navot, he's very angry at Achav, to jump up and say, I'm going to punish him, that's not a positive thing. Even though maybe Achav was deserving of it, but it shouldn't have been in that way. But maybe you would think that, but they say, no, not necessarily. Maybe God didn't want him in his midst because if you speak lies, you will not stay established, and again, before God. So what's the issue here? Well, he came up with a solution that involved lying by being the Ruach Sheker B'fi HaNevi'im, right? That he gave this false testimony to the prophets, and maybe that's why God didn't want him around, and not because he was the one causing the punishment. So let's try another pasuk. Elamehacha Savata Kalomi Kavod. You're going to have more. This is about Nebuchadnezzar. They're going to say you've had more embarrassment than you're going to have. Much more embarrassment than respect, and we're going to see that he was very well respected, or at least feared. But yet his embarrassment is going to be much greater. Shtei gamata v'ha'arel. Now, shtei gamata, you also are going to drink from what they call in the Nevi'im the kos hatarela, the terrible. You're going to drink the bad potion, which is going to punish you, and the v'ha'arel, and you. Sounds like they're saying you also with the arel. The arel is a reference to someone who doesn't have a brit milah. It's a reference to Nebuchadnezzar. And what they're darshaning here is that, here, I'll read it inside, Savata kalom mikavod, ze Nebuchadnezzar. Shtei gamata v'ha'arel, ze Tzidkiyahu. The Tzidkiyahu, who was the king of Yehuda at the time of the destruction, he's going to get punished just like Nebuchadnezzar. Now, why is that? It must be because he caused Nebuchadnezzar to get punished. Why is that? Not because Nebuchadnezzar brought the Churban, which is what you would have thought, but because of this crazy story they're going to tell us. Okay, so first, actually, I'll hold off on the story. We're going to see the story in a few minutes, but basically the quick story is that Nebuchadnezzar what he did was he raped all the kings that he conquered. And he basically raped them. And on account of that, Tzidkiyahu is going to get punished because Nebuchadnezzar was punished for raping Tzidkiyahu, and therefore Tzidkiyahu caused Nebuchadnezzar to get punished. So that's exactly what we're trying to prove. So the Gemara doesn't like this. They say, Chada dekula krab Nebuchadnezzar ktiv. The subject of this is Nebuchadnezzar. It's not like the first part is Nebuchadnezzar, the second part is someone else. No, the whole pasuk is referring to Nebuchadnezzar. They don't like the way they read the pasuk. And number two, va'od, Tzidkiyahu tzadika. He was a tzaddik. He was getting raped. What could he have done? And this goes back to what I said in the beginning. How can you blame these people? What did he do? He did nothing. He was raped. And he's called a tzaddik. We're going to see when they tell the story, which they're going to tell only at the end of the daf, he's actually called a tzaddik. So if he's a tzaddik, a righteous person, how could he possibly be punished for this? Blah, blah, blah. That's going to be the story. We're going to see it later in full. But they call him Oto Tzaddik. Okay, first of all, his name was also Tzidkiyahu, even though he happened to be not a great king, but they say in this area he was a tzaddik, he wasn't an accomplice to what happened. Ella, so it must be mehacha. Gam enosh tzaddik lo tov. Okay, here's a pasuk from Mishlei. If you punish, even a tzaddik to punish other people, it's not good. It's not good for a tzaddik to punish other people. Ein lo tov ela. So the first thing they say is the word lo tov means not good, which is basically synonymous with bad, and then substitute that into the following pasuk. Uchtiv ki lo el chafetz rasha ata lo yugorcha ra. God doesn't want evil, and ata lo yugorcha ra. No one is going to dwell with God. Yugorcha is to dwell, right? Ra is not going to dwell with God. Now fill it in. If someone who punishes, even if he's a tzaddik, if he punishes someone, he's considered lo tov, which means he's considered ra. And it says lo yugorcha ra. Someone who's ra can't live with God. So there you have it, that you can't dwell with God if you cause the punishment of a rasha. So now they say, tzaddik ata Hashem, v'lo yagor b'mchocha ra, right? God is a tzaddik, and he doesn't want to dwell with anyone who's ra. My mashma, now we're back to our Mishnah. So that's how we got to our proof. Now, my mashma, the hai chalashim, lishna depurahu. How do we know the chalashim in our Mishnah means lots, cast lots? Dichtiv. And now we're back to Nebuchadnezzar. You think we're moving on, but we're actually back to him. It says about Nebuchadnezzar, Ech nafalta mishamayim. How did you fall from the heavens, right? You were so amazing, Nebuchadnezzar. You were so strong. Not amazing in a good way, but he was so strong and powerful. Hillel ben Shachar, this shooting star or some kind of comet that fell from the heavens. Nigdat al aretz, you fell onto the ground. Cholesh al goyim. Now, what does it mean, cholesh al goyim? This is exactly our story that we said. He would cast lots on all the kings he conquered. Which one was he going to rape that day? So there you have cholesh means casting lots. And it says, okay, this is all the malchei goyim. Kulam shachvu bechavod ish bebeito. When Nebuchadnezzar dies, it says they all rested peacefully in their houses. What does that mean? He was no longer coming to rape them. Amar Rabbi Yochanan shenachu mishkav zachor. That they were finally able to rest in peace, not in the sense of we mean rest in peace but die, but they were able to be in their beds without being concerned he was going to rape them. Amar Rabbi Yochanan kol yamav shalato rasha. Now we're going to talk about all these things in Nebuchadnezzar until the next Mishnah. All the days of that rasha lo nimsa schok bepeh kol bria. Nobody laughed. When he died, it said everyone burst out in happiness. From there you can infer nobody was happy before him. Everybody was scared of him. You can't even go to where his house was. It says the demons are going to be dancing there. Here's the story. When he tried to rape Tzidkiyahu, right, it was his turn. Okay, his orla, his foreskin, stretched 300 amod. Okay, this is obviously an exaggerated story. Imagine all the kings were there and he was casting lots and it fell on Tzidkiyahu. So in terms of, to prevent him from doing this and to embarrass him, this is where we said, Savata kalon mikavod. He was wholly embarrassed. What happened, right? It kind of surrounded, his orla surrounded all the people at the party. Shenemar Savata kalon mikavod, right? For all his kavod he had, now he was hugely embarrassed. And Arel Gematria is 300 in Gematria. That's how we know it's 300 Amah, that the foreskin was stretched. Okay, now we have the scene. He goes into hell. What happens? Rashu kol yordei Gehenom. Everybody in Gehenom was scared. They said, Amru, Shemalim Shola Leinu Huba. Is he coming to rule over us down here? Oh, lichlot kamotam huba. Or is he coming to basically be sick like us in Gehenom, in hell? Shene'amar gam ata chulata kamonu elenu nimshalta. Okay, so here's the pasuk where it says, are you going to be sick like us? Or elenu nimshalta. Now, elenu nimshalta can mean one of two things. Mashal is a comparable. Are you going to be like us? Or it's also from the word moshel, to rule. So the darshan here, it means they're asking, are you going to come rule over us? You can imagine their fear. Nobody wants Nebuchadnezzar to come down into hell with them. So Yatztabat Kol, a heavenly voice comes out and says, Mimina Amta, who do you think you're greater than? Redev Hashkava Eta Orlim. You're going to be down in the ground like the Arelim, and basically you're finished. You're not going to rule over anybody there. Ech Shavat Noges Shavtam Adheva. How did they darshan this pasuk? It's again describing what happens when Nebuchadnezzar dies. These are pasukim that are describing what happened in his death. It's for all from most of these pasukim are from Yeshayahu Perek Yudalid. Was Madheva, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, Shavta Umazo. It was the destruction, right? They stopped. It stopped this nation. Sha'amra Midod V'Haveh, that always said to the people, measure out your money and give us, meaning they were constantly taxing us. V'Kadam, where some people said Sha'amra, right? There's a play on words of Madheva, Midod Haveh. Some people say Sha'amra Me'od Ma'od Haveh, bring us a lot below Midah, meaning they kept taking taxes without actually even giving us a set amount. They just kept saying more and more and more. But we'll just finish up to the mission. Okay, one more pasuk about him. It says in Daniel, he describes Nebuchadnezzar as he had one extra thing. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba melamed sherachav al ariz achar v'kashar tanim berosho lekayem ma shenemar v'gam et chayat hasadeh natati lo la'ovdo. Basically, he ruled over not only people, he ruled over the animals, and he rode on a lion, right? Nobody rides on a lion because lions can't be tamed by people. He rode on a lion, and he had a serpent, which is also everyone's always fearful of, around the neck of the lion. Okay, so basically he ruled over everybody. This is how amazing, how strong and powerful he was. And then, you know, obviously how hugely embarrassed he was at the end, and how he ended up at the bottom of Gehenom like everybody else there. Okay, with that, we'll end for today and pick up with the new Mishnah tomorrow.